So just to talk about the nervous system, kind of do an overview first. I know you guys are familiar with these terms. The nervous system, the whole thing is divided into two parts. The central nervous system, abbreviated CNS, and this is called central because it is centrally located. So this is the brain and spinal cord, okay? And then what branches off of the brain and spinal cord are the nerves. These are called peripheral nerves because they go out into the periphery of the body, and they make up the peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nerves are divided into two groups depending on if they branch off of the brain, and those are called cranial nerves, or if they branch off the spinal cord, and these are called spinal nerves. Okay? And that's basically all there is to it. This is the whole nervous system. It'd be nice if it was that simple, but that really is the whole thing. Okay, and this is a picture of it. So again, kind of simplified, but you can see the brain and spinal cord. This is the CNS. And then all of these nerves coming off the brain, you can see some of them look like they come directly off the brain. Those are our cranial nerves. These go out mostly to structures within the head. And then these are spinal nerves that branch off the spinal cord. And nerve supply just about every tissue in the body. Very few tissues do not have nerve supply, like the enamel of our teeth. Certain tissues here and there do not have nerve supply, but it's pretty rare. Just about everything in the body has nerve supply. Okay, so there are two types of information that are carried on our nerves, sensory and motor. And I just want to introduce these other terms here, somatic and visceral, because we will be hearing and seeing these as we go along. So this is just kind of an introduction. If this doesn't make a lot of sense to you right now, don't worry about it. But somatic is a term that just means body. That's all it means. Viscera or visceral refers to organs, like the internal organs. Okay, so we have these two types of sensory information. Somatic sensory information comes from the skin, muscles, and joints. Okay, sensory information from the skin, muscles, and joints. Visceral sensory information is from our internal organs, also called viscera. Okay, so sensations like pain, cramping, nausea, hunger, those kinds of sensations are visceral sensory sensations. Okay, if we're talking about motor, meaning movement, right, like motor neurons, there are, again, two types of motor impulses. Somatic motor neurons would carry action potentials or impulses to skeletal muscle. Okay. These would go to skeletal muscle. Now, when we're talking about motor, we usually use the term autonomic. You can think of this as kind of being synonymous with visceral. So I'm just going to say / visceral, because these actually do go to our organs. What type of muscle do we have in our organs? Smooth muscle, yes. Remember, smooth muscle, and what type of muscle is in the heart? And cardiac. These two types of muscle tissue cannot be controlled voluntarily, right? And this is what our autonomic neurons do. They control smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, the stuff we can't control consciously. Autonomic means without our conscious control. This is the part of the nervous system that controls everything we can't control consciously. Okay? And this is actually covered in chapter 18. Somatic motor neurons are the ones that we have already talked about that would supply our skeletal muscle, right? Which we control consciously or voluntarily. Okay, so again, we're just kind of doing a little definitions here. This will make more sense later as we get into parts of the nervous system, okay? You guys have any questions on that for now? So this is a table, chart, whatever, that's in your book in chapter 14 that just kind of gives you an overview of the nervous system. This is what we just talked about. So again, broken down into two types of information, sensory and motor, and you can see for each of those, they're just explaining what the somatic and visceral, or also called autonomic, parts would do, okay? So this is what we just talked about. Okay, so nervous tissue. Nervous tissue, of course, is in the nervous system. In nervous tissue, we have two types of cells, neurons and then the supporting cells, which are called neuroglia, and we'll talk about those later. Okay, so we're going to talk first about neurons, also sometimes called nerve cells. Now we know these send electrical signals that are called action potentials. Remember that the only cells in the body that can do this are neurons and muscle cells. So this is a really important function of neurons. This is actually how neurons communicate with each other. It's how we receive and process sensory information. It's how we store memories. It's how we make decisions. You know, how we think about whatever we're thinking about. Everything is sent by action potentials. It's how we decide how and when we're going to move. Everything is done with action potentials. Now, once our nervous system and neurons are mature, once we're fully developed and their nervous system is mature, neurons, and for the most part, cannot divide. So if they are damaged, that usually will result in some loss of function and formation of scar tissue. There are a couple areas in the brain where neurons can divide throughout life. One of those is in the area that's responsible for memory, the hippocampus, so that's a good thing. But for the most part, they do not divide. So this means that usually brain tumors, when you hear about people having brain tumors, they usually are not tumors of neurons because neurons can't divide to form tumors. We have three types of neurons based on their structure, and then three types based on their function. Okay, so let's talk about those different types. You guys have any questions on this before we go on?
What are the tumors then? Are they just the other type?
I'm sorry, what are
the other type of nerve cell? Or the
Yeah, so brain tumors, are you asking what they would be?
Yes.
Yeah, they're tumors that are usually tumors of the neuroglial cells. Like the most common is called a glioblastoma, and glio meaning neuroglia or glial cells, which are the supporting cells. And they surround neurons, they have different functions, and we'll talk about those next. But those cells can divide throughout our life, and so they can divide to form tumors. Okay, so these are the different types based on their function. Okay, so functional types. Okay, so we know we have sensory and motor neurons, right? And you guys already know the definition because we've already talked about this. Okay, and if you think about it, this makes sense. And just so you know, another word for sensory is afferent, okay, with an A. So sensory neurons are going to carry information to the CNS, right? This is the information that's coming in from outside of us. It's what we're seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, whatever. It's also information that would come from the organs telling the brain what's going on with different parts of the body, the position the body is in, how we're moving. All of those are different types of sensory information. So a sensory neuron is a neuron that carries impulses, aka action potentials, from the sensory receptors to the CNS. Okay, motor neurons are also called efferent with an E, These do the opposite. These carry action potentials away from the CNS to muscle or glands, okay? We've already talked about the definition of a motor neuron, so you guys already know that. Okay, but very interesting. It seems like this would pretty much account for all the neurons in the nervous system, right? Seems like that would make sense, that that would be it. But over 99% of all of our neurons are actually this third type. So you might think, well, how can that be? Because we have millions of neurons that are sensory or motor. But this is literally billions and billions of neurons. And interneurons, their job is to connect different areas of the brain and the spinal cord to kind of connect all those different areas, allow them to communicate with each other so that sensory information can be processed, it can be stored as memories, it can be used to, you know, determine what movement we will be making as a result of the incoming information. So these are usually short neurons. They are entirely within the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and they allow different areas of the CNS to communicate with each other. Okay, they are entirely within the central nervous system. Okay, so these are the three types based on their function. Let's talk about what these would look like. Questions on this before we go on?
What did you say the part of they facilitate efficiency?
I'm sorry, I can't hear
You
you.
said they connect the brain.
Different areas of the brain to each other, and also they connect the brain to the spinal cord. So any neuron that's entirely within the CNS, where, you know, the cell body and the end of its axon are entirely within the CNS, that would be an interneuron. And this is what the brain and spinal cord are composed of. It's just billions of neurons, so we have a lot of these. Okay, so these are the three types based on their structure. You guys already know what a motor neuron looks like, right? We kind of drew that and talked about it a little bit. Motor neurons are this type, okay? They are called multipolar. Multipolar means they have many processes attached to the cell body. Neurons are named after those processes that stick out from the cell body. Okay, so multi, of course, meaning many. These, remember, had many dendrites. So these are the ones that have all these processes sticking out that look kind of like that, and then that one long process called the axon that branches. These would have the synaptic knobs. Here's our cell body with our nucleus. Okay, so what do dendrites do? These receive incoming signals, right, from other neurons. From other neurons. Okay, so where do we find these? Again, this is what our motor neurons look like. So, okay, motor neurons are multipolar, but also notice that interneurons, the ones we just talked about, where we said they make up over 99% of all of our neurons, they are this type. So multipolar neurons are the most common in the nervous system. And as you can imagine, just, you know, try to imagine an area in the brain that has to communicate with other parts of the brain. It is estimated that on average, a neuron in the brain has about 1,000 synapses. So roughly 1,000 neurons it's, you know, communicating with. That is a huge number of synapses. So these little dendrites are, you know, pretty busy receiving incoming signals from other neurons. This process here is called the you guys know that, right? Axon, right? Right. And the axon sends action potentials. Okay, so remember the action potential is electrical current that literally travels down the axon. So it's going to go all the way down. Usually we'll start right here at the beginning of the axon. And remember, when the action potential gets to the end of the axon, what happens? What is stored here in the synaptic knobs?
Acetylcholine.
Right, this would be, it could be acetylcholine depending on the type of neuron, but it's the neurotransmitter, and when the axon, when the action potential reaches the end of the axon, the neurotransmitter is released. It will bind to receptors on the motor end plate, the next neuron, whatever it happens to be, whatever it's synapsing on. Okay, so the next type of neuron is called a bipolar. So this name tells you it has how many processes attached to the cell body? Two, yes. There is going to be one dendrite and one axon. And we'll take a look at this in just a minute. And these are actually the least common of all neurons. These are found only in the special senses. And when we think of special senses, I think we usually think of touch also, but technically touch is not considered to be one of the special senses. These are actually found only in the nasal cavities, where they would carry smell, the inner ear, okay, where they of course are responding to sounds, and also equilibrium is in the inner ear, and then the retina of the eye. So actually these are the only places that we have bipolar neurons, so we don't have a lot of these in the body. Okay, and then the last type is called a unipolar neuron. Unipolar would have how many processes attached to the cell body? One, yes. The one short process will split so that one will carry the action potential into the central nervous system. One of the processes carries the action potential toward the cell body. So we'll take a look at these in just a second. So these would be all of the rest of our sensory neurons. Okay? Sensory neurons that carry things like touch, pressure, pain, temperature, all of those other types of sensations besides the special senses. Okay, so let's take a look at a diagram that shows these three types. You guys have any questions on that before we go on? Okay, so taking a look at these, this is a diagram that will be on the practical exam. I will have you identify the three different types, and you should be able to identify their processes, okay? Okay, so you can see here, these are both multipolar. They're just showing you a couple of different, slightly different looking multipolar neurons. They work basically the same. All of these dendrites would carry the signals to the cell body. The axon, you can see where the blue arrow is pointing in that direction, showing you that the axon carries the action potential away from the cell body. Now in these pictures, you can't see synaptic knobs, but they would be here. It's just not showing that much detail. Okay, so let's take a look here at the bipolar. You can see again two processes. Notice this one is showing that the information is coming toward the cell body. So this process acts as the dendrite, carrying the information to the cell. And this process would be the axon, carrying the action potential away from the cell body. So again, we would have synaptic knobs here. You just can't see them in this picture. And then finally, this is the unipolar. Notice just one process attached to the cell body, but here it will split. So this process is going to carry the action potential into the central nervous system. So this is sometimes called the central process. And this is the part that's carrying the action potential in from the periphery. This could be carrying touch from somewhere in the body, somewhere on the skin. So this is called the peripheral process. But you can call this whole thing the axon. Okay, in a unipolar neuron, you can call the whole thing the axon. The dendrites are just right here at the very end This would be somewhere out in the body, you know, skin, wherever, and these would be responding to some kind of sensation from, you know, sensory receptors, maybe out in the skin. And then the axon carries the action potential into the CNS. So here, again, we would have synaptic knobs with a neurotransmitter at the end of the axon. Okay? So sensory, special senses, and these would be motor and interneurons. Okay? Do you guys have any questions on that? Okay. So let's take a look now at a neuron up close, just so we can see a few things that are unique to neurons. Okay, so we've talked about these parts, but let's look at them in a little bit more detail. What type of neuron is this based on its structure? Multipolar, right. And we also have a model of this. So notice this is not one of the figure numbers I gave you. I don't think, or is it? Did I give you this one?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I didn't mean to. Yeah, I just thought of that. I think I did give you this one. But yeah, take this one off your list. Sorry about that. The last one, though, will, you know, oh yeah, okay. So yeah, this one definitely will, but 14.3 will not. Okay, so you guys see, when you take a look at this, if you don't have your book with you, you will see that next to this diagram, there is a photograph of a multipolar neuron. This is one of the slides that you'll be looking at, and it will look very much like that photograph. Okay, so you will be identifying a multipolar neuron, and all of the cells around it will be neuroglial cells. So it will look very much like that photograph that you see next to this. Okay, so this is a model of a multipolar neuron. This is why the diagram will not be on the test. We'll use this model, and you can see all of these things here are the dendrites. These are actually axons of other neurons that are synapsing on this neuron. Okay, so you can see the end of the axons and the synaptic knobs. Okay, this is kind of a blown up axon, just to show you in more detail. Okay, so notice that the very beginning of the axon here, this is the area we were saying is where the action potential would start. This is the most sensitive part of a neuron electrically. So this is the area where the action potential is triggered. This is called the axon hillock. Okay, axon hillock. So I would like you to know that. It's kind of the triangular shaped part where the axon connects to the cell body. And here you can see synaptic knobs at the end of the axon that would store the neurotransmitter. Notice that it looks like there's something wrapped around the axon. This is actually a type of neuroglial cell that we will talk more about later on. Okay, so we'll come back to what looks like a bunch of hot dog buns wrapped around the axon, okay? So taking a look here at the cell body, notice you see a bunch of these little kind of what look like little splotchy structures in the cytoplasm of the neuron. This is called the chromatophilic, which means color-loving substance. You can also call this the Nissl bodies, or Nissl substance, named after someone who studied the neuron. This is actually rough endoplasmic reticulum and free-floating ribosomes. Okay, so it is the RER plus the free ribosomes. And neurons have a lot of rough endoplasmic reticulum and free ribosomes because they constantly are replacing parts of the cell membrane, because the cell membrane is very active in neurons. always sending action potentials, so it tends to kind of wear out and parts of the membrane will be replaced kind of regularly. So a lot of RER and ribosomes. Okay, so this is something that's kind of unique to neurons. You can see it on this model as this blue stuff. All this blue stuff in here is supposed to be the missile bodies. Okay, also notice that on the model you see some dark lines coming into the dendrite here and also into the axon. Although your book talks about these, it doesn't really show them in this picture. So I will just draw some of these in just to kind of illustrate. These would actually kind of spread throughout the cytoplasm and into all of the processes. These are called neurofibrils. So neurofibrils are kind of similar to myofibrils in muscle cells. They are bundles of neurofilaments. Okay, so what is a neurofilament? It is basically part of the cytoskeleton. If you guys remember when we talked about the cell, we said that the cell has the cytoskeleton that kind of maintains its shape. Okay, part of the cytoskeleton are the intermediate filaments. Intermediate filaments are really stiff. So the neurofibrils are really intermediate filaments that help to maintain the shape of all of the processes. This is very important in neurons because those processes have to be able to reach out and form synapses with other neurons. So if they lose their shape, then they lose their function. And so this is really important for helping to maintain the normal function in a neuron. Okay, so those are some parts of the neuron. Questions? Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about synapses. This is basically like the neuromuscular junction. You guys have this? Actually, it's pretty much exactly like the neuromuscular junction, except instead of looking at the neuron and a muscle fiber, we're going to look at two neurons synapsing on each other. This is common terminology when we're talking about a synapse, and you guys will use this terminology a lot when you take physiology, because you're going to talk a lot about synapses and neurotransmitters and all that stuff. So looking at a synapse up close, this is a synapse between two neurons. Just ignore this. They're just comparing it to a gap junction, but we are done with gap junctions. Okay, so notice this is the end of the axon. Here's our synaptic knob or synaptic bulb. These are the little synaptic vesicles with the neurotransmitter. So they are using acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter, okay, which we have already talked about. And when they say nerve impulse, this is the same thing as an action potential. So the action potential travels to the end of the axon. That causes the release of the acetylcholine. Okay, notice that this vesicle here is releasing its acetylcholine. Remember, this little microscopic gap here is called the synaptic cleft. Cleft is a space, right? Cleft means space. So this is the synaptic cleft. So the acetylcholine travels across the synaptic cleft and is binding to receptors here. But this is not the motor end plate because this is another neuron. So this is just that other neuron's membrane, and it has receptors for acetylcholine. So the acetylcholine binds to its receptors here, and now this neuron, as a result of that, may have its own action potential, okay, depending on, you know, all of the incoming signals from other neurons. So this is exactly like the neuromuscular junction, but this is not a muscle fiber, it's the membrane of another neuron. So when you're talking about a synapse, usually you refer to this as the presynaptic neuron, meaning before the synapse, and this would be the postsynaptic neurons membrane here. Okay. So again, this is terminology you guys will use a lot when you're taking physiology, because you talk a lot about different types of neurotransmitters and just their receptors, things like that. Okay. So let's take a look at where synapses can, occur between two neurons. So these are different synapses based on where the axon is meeting that next neuron. Okay, so taking a look here, and this is just a picture that's showing two multipolar neurons synapsing on each other. Okay, and this is just kind of a simplified drawing. So again, something that you'll be doing a lot when you take physiology and you talk about a synapse, you just kind of draw your neurons like that because it's easier. Okay, so taking a look here, notice that this axon of this neuron here, so this would be our presynaptic neuron. Okay, so its axon is synapsing on the cell body of this postsynaptic. Here's our postsynaptic neuron. Okay, and the cell body is commonly called the soma. Remember, soma means body. Okay, so this would be an axosomatic synapse, and you can see it's labeled for you here, between the axon and the cell body. Okay, axosomatic. Another possibility is, notice here, this presynaptic neuron's axon is synapsing on the dendrites of the postsynaptic, so this would be an axodendritic synapse, right, between the axon and the dendrites. And then finally, this axon is synapsing on the axon of the postsynaptic neuron. This is kind of a rare type of synapse, but they do happen. So this is called an axonic synapse between the two axons. Okay, so these names just tell you where the synapse is occurring. Okay? If you take a look at the model, you will see the model also shows you different locations for the synapses. So this one, notice the axon is synapsing on the dendrite here. So this would be an axodendritic. Okay, this one is on the cell body or soma. So this would be an axosomatic. This actually does not have an axoaxonic synapse on it, but it shows you the other two. Okay. I'm sorry, what was that?
Which one was axodendritic?
These would be axodendritic, wherever the axon is on a dendrite. So these are the dendrites of this neuron. These orange things are axons from other neurons synapsing on this one. Okay, so anytime you see the axon on a dendrite, that would be an axodendritic synapse. Okay. You guys have questions, other questions on any of that? Okay. And I think this next diagram just gives you kind of an example of what these neurons might look like in the body, so you get kind of a better feeling for how all of this would, be organized in the actual nervous system. So here you can see a sensory neuron is carrying some kind of sensory information, let's say from the skin of kind of the upper chest area And notice this is a unipolar neuron. Unipolar meaning one process attached to the cell body. Remember that sensory neurons, except for special senses, are unipolar. So this information is going to come into the spinal cord, okay? And it's showing how the sensory neuron might synapse on a little interneuron in the spinal cord. Remember, interneurons are often very short, and they're entirely within the CNS, and they are multipolar. So this is a little interneuron connecting the sensory neuron to a motor neuron. And so here, notice the motor neuron, again, it's going to be multipolar. The axon is going to go out on a nerve to muscles that we would use to maybe, scratch the area, depending on whatever that sensory information might have been. So this just shows you kind of how the neurons are laid out. Notice how long these neurons are. They literally go from the body part all the way into the spinal cord, okay? And the motor neurons go from the spinal cord all the way back out to different parts of the body. So neurons are the longest cells in the body, many, many feet long. And they travel on nerves. So if you're wondering, well, how is this going out, from the spinal cord out into the body, it's traveling in a nerve. And that's what a nerve is. A nerve is a group of axons traveling together.
Okay, that kind of answers my question. I was like, so unlike the muscle fibers, it's not one long cell, it's like a series of axons connecting?
No, that's what I'm saying. It's one long cell.
So just like
This is
muscle
one,
fibers.
yes. So this is one cell. Muscle cells are long, depending on the muscle. Like for instance, the sartorius muscle, which is the longest muscle in the body, has, parallel fibers that are very long, right? Goes from the iliac crest all the way down to the tibia here. So those are really long. These are the longest cells in the body though, or they can be. I mean, some neurons are the longest cells in the body because they can literally go from the medulla, which is part of the brain stem, all the way down to the foot. So this is one cell. This is one cell. So it's not a series. Now, information that's going to go from the body, the skin here, that will be carried up to the brain will go on a couple of different neurons to get all the way up to the cortex where we are aware of it on a conscious level. There would have to be a couple of connections on the way up to the brain. But not very many, really a couple, to get that information up to the brain.
Is there any way, you can scratch or move through biting and rest on it?
Yeah, they can be, definitely. I mean, neurons are really not meant to stretch a long way, so they can be damaged if they're overstretched. I think, that does happen sometimes where we get some nerve pain from stretching, body parts where they're suddenly stretched, overstretched. But, and if a nerve is completely severed, then it often cannot be repaired, where it will be functional again. So, any other questions on any of that? Okay. So this is a good time to take a break because we are going to talk about the other type of cell in nervous tissue, which is neuroglia. So let's take a break. We'll come back. We'll cover these, and then we will be through chapter 14. Okay. So let's come back let's make it